Revelation study. And maybe one thing I want to talk about, we talked about this class being kind of used the title 55 Final Events in World History. Haven't really been talking about that a lot, and that's the title of a book by Robert Morris. And in there, your timeline, the one thing, it has a list of 50 different events. All those 50 events, we're in agreement, they all take place. But you probably noticed by now, I don't put them in the same order. Like in there, he has the trumpets all taking place before the middle point. I don't think they all take place before the middle point. So when you're studying Revelation, you'll find that there's a lot of different ways that people try to understand how to lay it out. And so that's fine. This is a very symbolic book. And so the main thing we want to always remember, what's the title of the book? The Revelation of Jesus Christ, okay? So if you get that right, you got it right. It's about Christ coming again. And I think there's a lot of comfort, and there's definitely joy in the Christ of the Gospels, in understanding that God came to this earth as a man to relate to us. But I think to see him as the risen Lord is very, very important. That we understand that one day every knee is going to bow and every tongue will confess before the risen Christ, okay? And that's what Revelation is revealing to us, Christ in his glory and his sovereignty as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so I think what comes out of this to me more than anything as I study Revelation is just the sense of the worthiness of Jesus Christ to receive our worship and to receive our surrender to him. Okay? And so I think that's what we're really shooting for in the book. Now, on the next slide, you'll notice, as I said, it's really easy to figure out this book. And there's 22 chapters that are divided pretty sequentially, pretty easily. Chapter 1 is introduction, right? That's where the first revelation or revealing of Jesus. And in chapter 2 and 3, we have the letters, 7 letters to 7 literal churches in the first century, that Jesus wrote letters to them. Now, those churches really, I think, are representative of churches in any day and any age. You can walk into a church today, and it might be just like Thyatira. You might walk into another church, it may be just like Laodicea, lukewarm, not hot or cold. So I think there's different characteristics in those churches that probably churches naturally can take on the characteristic of. But the most important thing to those letters is how Jesus revealed himself to each of them. Jesus showed himself. Then we got to chapter 4 and 5, and we are in that throne room scene that we keep going back and forth to, right? Revelation takes us down on the earth. It shows us the judgments, and then we're back up in heaven, and John's vantage point looking down on the earth. And so we see the worship of heaven, people of every language, tribe, nation, assembled before the throne. And then chapter 6 through 18 is kind of the meat of the book of Revelation. That is the 7 years of judgment, the tribulation period. And those first 3.5 years, we got divided with that hash line. Those first 3.5 years are the beginning of sorrows. Jesus called them in Matthew 24. The last 3.5 years, he called the Great Tribulation there in Matthew chapter 24. There's someone trying to get into the door back there, so maybe you just want to prop it. Yeah. Aaron, Rick has it. Yeah, let's just make sure we undo one of them when we're here. So anyway, so that's those 7 years between chapter 6, chapter 18. We haven't gotten to the end yet, but chapter 19, we see the line coming down. That's the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. And then in chapter 20, we have the 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth, the millennium, the great white throne, the final judgment. And chapter 21 and 22 have the heavenly Jerusalem. We have the end time heavenly vision from the Lord. And so where we're going to be tonight, if you go to the next slide, and by the way, this simplifies it. We just went 2 slides, but anyway, this simplifies it. You see the red line, chapter 4, that depicts the Christians being raptured away from the earth, and in chapter 19, returning with Christ to the earth. Now, the way I teach the book of Revelation, we've been studying it, is different layers, where God is just layering over and over again different accounts of how we're making our way to the return of Jesus Christ. So in chapter 6, we looked at the seals, right? I believe the sixth seal takes us right up to the end, to the return of Christ. The seventh seal begins the trumpet judgments. The trumpet judgments, I think when they start, they don't go all the way back to where the seals were. They pick up probably around the fourth or fifth seal, I believe. And then that seventh trumpet, which we'll look at tonight, it takes us once again to the end, to the return of Christ. And that seventh seal trumpet also we're going to see actually is what starts the seven vials, or the seven last plagues being poured out. But we have this kind of other layer he puts in there of the works of the Antichrist. So the seals take us through the tribulation period. Then the trumpets take us again through the tribulation period. Then the works of the Antichrist take us through the last 3.5 years. And then the vials, or the final judgments, take us kind of to the end point of the last 3.5 years. But they all bring us to the same conclusion, which is the title of the book, which is what? The Revelation of Jesus Christ. So that's the point of the book. And so I think God's just given us one account after another. I like to talk about it or think about it like the four Gospels, right? The four Gospels give you four different accounts of the same thing, almost the same thing. Matthew and Luke talk about the birth of Jesus Christ. They include genealogies. Mark doesn't. John only really deals with the last couple of, last year and a half, really more in concentration of Christ's life. And John's probably spends more time on the last week of Jesus' life than anyone. So the four Gospels give us four accounts of the same thing. What's God doing? He's layering more information and more understanding. It's like, let's say you have interest in a historical figure, Winston Churchill, right? You just love to learn about Winston Churchill. So you might go on vacation and get 3 different books written by 3 different people about Winston Churchill. None of them are lying, maybe, right? But what they're doing is they're maybe giving you a different vantage point, a different theme, a different thing to consider. And that's what the Gospels do on the life of Christ. And I believe that's what the book of Revelation is doing about the return of Jesus Christ. So that's really how I make sense of it and the way that I teach it. And so that's that. And we'll go to the next slide. And so tonight, what we're going to pick off, we're going to be looking at the seventh trumpet in just a minute. And it's right there at the very end of the trumpets where the blue X is. And that's where we're going to go ahead and look. And so go ahead forward from there. All right, so last week we talked about, last time we were together, we were in chapters 10 through 11:15. Chapter 10, we were talking about the mighty angel and the little book. And then in chapter 11, if you guys remember, we were talking about the 2 witnesses. And the 2 witnesses, in verse 3 it says, I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. And so here we're introduced to this time frame of 3.5 years. Now, as we're studying going on into chapter 12 and chapter 13, this 3.5 year period is going to keep coming up over and over. And I believe what it's talking about is that last half of the tribulation period, that last 3.5 years where God really starts talking about the works of the Antichrist and what he's doing. Because if you look at God's 2 witnesses, it says that they are killed by the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit. And so we see that, and it says in verse 7, when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, will overcome them, and will kill them. Look at this. Vanna's bringing me coffee. Thank you. Lovely, lovely Vanna. Lovely, lovely Cheryl. I said her name right that time. I usually don't. I usually say Cheryl, and it's Cheryl, not Cheryl. But when you're from New Jersey, everything's Cheryl. So anyway, it's an accent thing. So you got these 2 witnesses that God says they're going to prophesy for 3.5 years, but they're going to get killed. And they get killed, but then they get resurrected, and it says that after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them. We're in verse 11. And they stood on their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying to them, here you go, come up here. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. And the same hour that these men are taken from the earth after 3.5 years of proclaiming, there was a great earthquake. Now, I don't know if you remember, if you go back, but the trumpets end, the seals end with a great earthquake. The trumpets are going to end with a great earthquake. The vials or the bowls or the 7 last plagues end with a great earthquake. I believe it's the same earthquake being described over and over again represents the end before the return of Jesus Christ. So one way I say when you're studying the book of Revelation, if you take the passages with the earthquake and let that be your kind of straight line and then work back from that or toward that, that kind of gives you that alignment you're looking for, okay? So he says here, the same hour that these witnesses are taken from the earth, it says there was a part of the city fell, Jerusalem, and in the earthquake were killed of men 7,000, and the remnant were afraid, and they gave glory to the God of heaven. Now that's interesting, because the typical thing that happens in the book of Revelation is when these judgments come from God is this: they refuse to repent. They refuse to repent. But at this one, it talked about there were people that actually glorified God. And so I don't know if I can take that. I probably can take that far enough to say that here's some people that because of this exercised faith in God. Was this an account of people being saved during that time period? It's not that clear, but they gave glory to God. On some level, they recognized God, as the creator and as the one who did this miracle. But now it says in verse 14, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe comes quickly. Now, just a bit. Talks about 3 woes. There's 7 trumpet judgments. The 5th, 6th, and 7th, it calls the final 3 woes. So the 5th trumpet, woe 1. The 6th trumpet, woe 2. Now he says the final woe, or the third woe, is about to take place, and that is the 7th trumpet. And it says in verse 15, and you can go ahead over to the next slide there. And so we went through the trumpets before this interlude and everything that took place. But now we go down to that 7th trumpet that I believe takes us to Christ's return. Again, look what it says here in verse 15. And the 7th angel sounded, and there was great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. So when this 7th trumpet starts, the kingdoms of the Lord of the earth become the kingdoms of Christ. So once again, I believe it's another layer that's taken us to the return of Christ. And it says, and the 24 elders which sat before God on their seats, they fell on their faces, and they worshiped God, saying, we give you thanks, O God, O Lord God Almighty, which are and was and are to come, which, by the way, is how Christ was described in chapter 1, because you have taken to you your great power and have reigned. So they're saying, we're giving you glory, Jesus, because you have taken your power to reign. So once again, I believe we're cycling to the end of the tribulation. And the nations were angry, and your wrath has come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and you should give reward to your servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear your name, small and great, and should destroy them which destroy the earth. And here's an important verse for timing. Look at verse 19. It says, and the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thundering and an earthquake and great hail. Now, that ends the 7th trumpet there. But notice what says happens there. The temple is opened in heaven. Well, it already talks about the Christ coming. Well, if you flip over and you go over to chapter number 16, go to chapter 15. Flip over to chapter 15. Because remember how the 7th seal opened up the trumpets? It's like the 7th seal, the only thing that happened is the trumpet started. The kind of same thing happens here with the trumpets. Because the last thing that happens with the seventh trumpet, it says that the temple in heaven was opened. But when you go to chapter 15 in verse 5, it says, after that I looked, and behold, the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony in heaven was opened. So I believe that that end verse talking about the trumpets and this verse, everything in between is like another interlude. And what happens when the temple is opened here in chapter 15? The 7 last angels come out with the 7 last plagues. So the 7th seal begins the trumpets. The 7th trumpet begins the 7 last plagues, or the vials. Now, it's layers though, right? It's layers. So the seals take us to the end, chapter 16. The trumpets take us to the end. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Christ. When we get to the vials, we'll see that they will also take us to the end. But God sandwiches one more layer in here. And it's not a layer of judgments this time. It's a layer of describing. We're going to talk about 7 persons. But really what he's doing, he's setting the stage to really explain and describe to us the Antichrist in some detail. And in order to do that, he gives us some background first. And so tonight, I think we're mostly going to look at the background that sets it up, and then next week really nail and get into more thoroughly about the Antichrist himself. And so we see this has taken place. So if you'll go to the next slide for me, I guess I'm going to do that from here. So this is where we're going to be, right here, folks. And so we're going to start here in chapter 12. So we finished the trumpets at the end of chapter 11, right? The 7 trumpets ended. And then we are beginning now chapter 12. Chapter 12, chapter 13, and chapter 14, like I said, it's kind of a whole new layer of information that we're about to be given. And but most of it's going to focus on the Antichrist and some of the things that set the stage for that. So let's go ahead and begin in chapter 12 and verse 1. It says, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. And it says, okay, so in verses 1 and 2, we have this woman that I believe is talking here about the nation of Israel. Okay, now, the Roman Catholic Church would interpret this as saying this is the Virgin Mary. And you'll even see pictures or cards depicting the Virgin Mary with the stars and the moon in the picture, and it's based on this. But it really doesn't make sense. Now they say it makes sense in the sense she gave birth. It makes sense that she went to heaven. But then later on it talks about her being persecuted by the dragon, fleeing into the wilderness for 3.5 years. Well, none of that matches up with Mary. So that interpretation kind of gets blown out of the water. So what does it make sense? Well, how do we try to find the answer to what something means in the Bible? Do you guys know by now? What do we do? Where do we look? We look inside where? The Bible. Guys, don't be afraid of me. I'm your friend. We look inside the Bible. Now, if you'll turn to the slide that says Genesis 37:9. Okay, in Genesis 37:9, it's talking about Joseph. And Joseph was one of the 12 tribes of Israel, one of the 12. It says he dreamed another dream, and he told it to his brothers, and he said, behold, I've dreamed a dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. They worship me. This dream got Joseph in a lot of trouble because when he gave the interpretation, he said, well, Dad, you're the sun. Mom, you're the moon. And brothers, you're the stars. And you're going to bow down to me? Now, they're already mad at him because the dad favored him. So this dream, if you go back, we're not going to study Genesis, gets Joseph in a lot of trouble. It's describing the same thing it's saying about this woman here, except it says here there's only 11 stars. Revelation, it says there's 12 stars. Why? Because who's the 12th one? It's Joseph. Remember, we looked at the 12 tribes in chapter 7 of Israel. And so what does his father, by the way, whose name was Israel, his mother and his brothers and him, what do they represent? That's the formation. That's the foundation of the nation of Israel. And so, okay, so we say, well, it seems to imply here that this is talking about Israel. Now, Israel giving birth did give birth of the Messiah through a Jewish girl, right? And her name was Mary. Okay, so there, yeah, so it talks about here. It says, the woman in heaven, she was clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, upon her head a crown, 12 stars. She, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to deliver. So there is this allusion to Mary as part of Israel. But when you go on and you look, the next thing we're going to look at, and we'll get back, Galatians 4:4, put this verse up, back to this being Israel. When the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his son. And how was his son made? He was made of a woman, Virgin Mary, and made under the what? The law. The law is the law of what nation? The law of Israel, the Mosaic law. So Christ came as a Jew born to the Virgin Mary. But why it makes more sense that this is talking about Israel, let's just read a bit and then I'll come back. Verse number 3, there appeared another wonder in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon. Okay, so go back to my telestrator. And so next we have this red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, to deliver her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. That's Jesus. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And here's where it breaks down not being the Virgin Mary. It says, and the woman fled in the wilderness where she has a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,263 days, 103 days. That's that 3.5 years again. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and they prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called who? The devil and Satan. So who's the dragon? The dragon's Satan, right? So let's keep reading. Which deceived, and we found out who the child was already, because he's ruling the nations with a rod of iron. That's Jesus. We'll get back there in a minute. And the great dragon was cast out, the old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now has come salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they loved not their lives to the death. Remember, we talked about that. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is coming down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. And when the dragon saw that he was cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she's nourished for a time, 1 year, and times 2 more years, and a half a time, 3.5 years. The 3.5 just keeps coming up, keeps coming up, keeps coming up. And she was nourished there from the face of the serpent, protected. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth or angry with the woman, and he went to make war with the remnant of her seed, Jewish people, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Okay, so the woman, starting out, she has a child. Yeah, you can see where they're thinking maybe this is the Virgin Mary. But when you start reading more and more, you realize that this doesn't really line up with her anymore. And it takes us from a past tense event that happened before the birth of Christ to something that's taking place currently during the tribulation period. That fits Israel. Now, why is this, what is this doing? This past tense, this present tense coming together. I believe the whole point of this is it's the background it's setting for the current crisis that is going to be the Antichrist coming to the earth. So I think really here that the first 5 verses is kind of taking us from kind of the beginning of the Bible. And it's taking us up to the place of Christ's birth. And it's telling us the role the people are going to kind of play in the story here in the middle of the tribulation period. Israel's going to have a part in the tribulation period. Remember we had the 12 tribes, the 144,000. Satan's going to play a part in the tribulation period. He's going to be persecuting the Jews during this time. And so these first really few verses are explaining about the woman, Israel. They're explaining about the dragon, Satan. They're explaining about the child that comes that's really hated by the devil, Jesus. It's setting the stage of showing us this is what happened in the past that's bringing us to what's happening here currently in the middle of the tribulation period, setting the stage, okay? So let's look at this Satan, okay, in verses 3 and 4. There appeared another wonder in heaven, a red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, now that's interesting. The 7-head illusion comes up over and over again in the book of Revelation. And if you go to Revelation chapter number 17, it actually describes to us what these 7 heads and 10 horns are. So Revelation chapter 17, beginning in verse 9, it says here, "And here's the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." Now, the woman is talking about not the woman we're reading about. This is a different woman. This woman here is called the Great Whore of Babylon. It's a different woman, okay? Verse 10. But it's the same 7 and the same 10 description. There are 7 kings. So what are the 7 heads? Well, they're kings. 5 of them have fallen. 1 of them is, and the other has not yet come. So these kings are talked about over and over. They're actually talked about in the book of Daniel. And here's what these kings are. What the Bible's describing to us between Israel and Satan and the Antichrist and God, God's kind of letting us in on this great cosmic battle between God and Satan. And in the tribulation period, the battlefield of the final battle is the earth. Man, they're going to come together at Armageddon. And so what God's describing for us, and so he's giving us in the language of the history of mankind, man's attempt to live without God, empires that have come, empires that are fallen. And if you go through the Bible, you'll see that these 7 empires are mentioned throughout the Bible. Okay? The first one you have when you're talking about these kings, you have Egypt under Pharaoh. Then after that, you have Assyria became the next dominant world power under Sennacherib. Then you had Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. Then you had the Medes and the Persians come to power. And then you had Alexander the Great come to power under Greece. That was 5. He said 5 are fallen and 1 is. So in the first century, what was the world power of the first century AD? It was Rome. So that's 5 have already fallen, 1 is, and he says there's 1 more yet to come. See, I know what that is. That's the United States of America. No, it's not actually. It's the revival of the Roman Empire that the Antichrist will come out of. Now, will America have a part in that? Could be. Most of that former empires is represented by all of the nations that are part of NATO. NATO, really, that collection of Western nations would be the makeup of the Roman Empire in the first century. Obviously, we weren't there, but you could see where we could morph in and blend in and kind of become part of all that. We don't know that dogmatically. The United States, I don't believe, is mentioned in prophecy. Some people say, well, that's probably because we don't exist, because we cease to exist. That's a possibility. I tend to think we're just going to kind of more and more probably yield our kind of sovereignty and identity to kind of more of a kind of Western kind of collective. You got the Western collective of NATO, and you got the king of the north, you got Russia, and then you got the kings of the east, and you got that Asian kind of collective, right? So I think, and you got, some Middle Eastern. So I think we just kind of morph into one of those. I think probably it's more an indication of the weakness that will come more and more upon us. That's kind of how I see it playing out. And I know that feels sad, especially if you're a red, white, and blue, red-blooded American. But do you realize there's not a nation yet that started out and built strong that stayed that way forever? You do know that, right? And America is not the promised land. Feels like it sometimes, but that's what heaven's for, right? And so sometimes I get a little upset with Christians in America. I think sometimes we don't know how to separate our Christianity from our Americanism, and we can confuse the two sometimes. And and so if America's getting weaker, it's like the sky's falling. Hey, the church doesn't get weaker. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Our number one identity is to who we are in Christ. And so when hell freezes over on the earth, so to speak, as far as nations go, if you know Christ, you're good. You're good, okay? And so don't get hung up in that. Be grateful for where you live. I believe it's probably the greatest place to live on the earth. Be thankful for what you have, but don't attach your identity to your Americanism. Always attach your identity to Christ. And be thankful that as a Christian, you're allowed to live in a place that has given you a favorable home as a Christian for many, many years. And most people in the world have never had that, right? So we be thankful, but we don't worship it, right? And I think we got to be careful with that sometimes, and in our identity especially. So here you have this dragon with this 7 heads. And so let me finish reading. So 5 are fallen, 1 is, I believe that's Rome, the other is not yet come, that's in the last days. And when he comes, and now it's talking about a he, I believe it's referring to the Antichrist, he will continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he, and we haven't even got to the beast yet completely, we'll get that in chapter 13, he's the 8th. So you have the revived Roman Empire in the last days, and from that Roman Empire will come the Antichrist, the last world ruler, and he is of the 7. Why? Because he comes out of the revived Roman Empire, the 7th. And he goes into perdition. He's actually called the son of perdition in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. So very short-lived power is going to be given to 10 kings in the tribulation period. So now, bouncing back on this diagram, you see Satan here, the dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay? And it says here he draws 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and he draws them to him, and he draws them from heaven. Verse 4, his tail drew the 1/3 part of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered to devour her child. Notice here, it describes Jesus as not having been born yet. That's why we know these first verses, they're talking about history. They're kind of filling in what brings us up to Christ. So what comes up to Christ is Satan, who represents the power of nations, the god of this world. And it talks about him drawing 1/3 part of the stars or the angels after him. Now, that's a past tense event as well, because in Luke chapter 10 and verse 18, here's what Jesus said. I think I have that, yeah. And Jesus said to them, he said, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. Now you notice how the word beheld is in the past tense? So Jesus, while he was on this earth 2,000 years ago, said before that he saw the day when Satan fell from heaven. And so the fall of Satan from heaven, that's how he came to the earth. That's how he tempted Adam and Eve. And Satan's got his angels. Satan's got his demons, his principalities, and his powers. And so up to this point in Revelation chapter 12, it's describing Israel. It's describing Satan. It's describing his fall from heaven. And all of that, it shows us taking place before Christ was born, because it says here, the dragon stood before the woman that was ready to be delivered. And why? He wanted to devour her child as soon as it was born. You know, it's an interesting study. If you study the line of Jesus Christ back through the Bible, you'll see over and over again where the line of Christ was threatened almost with destruction and annihilation. It's like Satan's satanic attempt to get to it. And even Christ at 2 years old, remember Herod sent the soldiers to kill all the children in Bethlehem under 2 years old. So Satan hates Christ. Satan has attempted in many ways to destroy Christ. And so God is just showing us here in this chapter 12, because the main point in this layer in the book of Revelation, we're going to learn a lot about the Antichrist. Well, what gets us to the Antichrist? Well, Satan's power gets us to the Antichrist. You can't be an Antichrist without a what? A Christ, right? So we got to see how he became anti. How did he get his name? Well, you have to have a Christ first, right? It's like there was some Grover that made this Grover, right? And that's the way it works. But now he's not of the line of Christ. He's opposite of Christ. He's opposing Christ. And so these first verses are giving us that. Now the woman Israel, verse 5, she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Do you realize what takes place there? She brought forth a child, and what happened to him? He was what? What's it say happened to him? Someone yell it out. Read the verse and yell it out. He was caught up into heaven, right? So was Jesus born on this earth? Yes. Was he caught up to heaven? Yes. Well, what happened between that? His entire life. So between those two halves of these two statements in this, you guys always think I'm trying to trick you. I'm not asking trick questions. So don't overthink it, okay? You guys are overthinking it. Don't overthink it. So what I'm saying, it says she brought forth her son. He was caught up to heaven. A lot took place in this verse between that. So you could make two parentheses in there, and everything between there is the life of Jesus Christ. But that's not the point he's making to us. The point that Christ was born, the point that Christ was back in heaven, that all took place. This is all bringing us back in line up to the tribulation period and what's about to take place here in the tribulation period. In verse 6, now I believe we're into the presence now, because this is after Christ was caught up into heaven. So we're past the life of Christ now. We're past his ascension. All of that was just history. That was just setting the stage to bring us right back to the middle of the tribulation period where we are right now, okay? Right where the trumpets were. So let's look what happens to Israel in verse 6 during the tribulation period. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared from God, that they would feed her there 1,260 days. So here's Israel, the same number that applied to the witnesses. We got it again, 3.5 years. So we keep seeing this reference to the 3.5 years, the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. Why do things heat up so much in these last 3.5 years? Remember that king of the bottomless pit in chapter 9 that was let up? You know, we saw the Antichrist in the very beginning of the tribulation period. He was the rider of the white horse. Remember the first seal? So he had been around the whole 7 years. He will be around. But it's not until the middle of the 7 years that he is revealed as the worker of Satan. That's when he demands to be worshiped. That's when he sets himself up in the temple. That's when he speaks great blasphemous things against God. And we're going to look a lot at that next week. I personally believe that the Antichrist will be Jewish. Because in Daniel it says he does not regard the God of his fathers, and it's the word Elohim. There's a good chance that he could be homosexual, because in that same verse it says about him that he does not have the desire of women. Now, modern translations change the translation around there where it says he has not the one who's the desire of woman. They make it a prophecy about Jesus, about he doesn't love Jesus. But translating that way is odd. I don't see that construct translated anywhere else. And in older translations, it would be translated, he does not have the desire of women. And so that's where I think sometimes when you get into translations, there's details that don't always make the ride from one to the other. They generally give you the whole thing. And that's why I would say this. Some translations of the Bible really are more paraphrases. They're not really designed to be studied. An extreme version of that would be like the Message. The Message is not really a Bible translation at all. It's a paraphrase. So I would see the Message, it's kind of more like a commentary. The NIV is probably halfway there, not all the way there. The writers of the NIV, it says in the preface, it said they were not striving for a word-for-word translation, but more the thoughts. And so those would be what we'd call more general equivalency, the Living New Testament, things like those are more reading, but when you want to get into word-for-word study, those are not really real technical translations. That would be more like modern representations of it would be like the ESV, the New American Standard, the New King James. Older representation would be like the King James Version. So those are technical translations of Scripture, where the other ones are more kind of paraphrasy. They're kind of, you can read them devotionally and kind of get the big picture, but I think if you're studying for detail, you want to use what's called a normal equivalency translation. It was translated more technically to give you more technical detail. Does that make sense? Okay, so, and a lot of people don't understand that. There is a difference, okay? And so, but here, so anyway, would I die on the hill that said the Antichrist may be homosexual? I wouldn't die on the hill. It makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways when you look at the Bible, really in light of today and political movement and all. I could see where that could play together real well in a world leader. The Antichrist is hardly ever described without him talking without his words and mouth blaspheming God. Seems like this character really doesn't like God a whole lot, or things that represent God. And there just seems to be these characteristics of him that are interesting, and perhaps even he's a Jewish person. And so interesting things. Now, I wouldn't die on any of those hills, but I just think it's interesting to contemplate this personage and what he would be like in that time. And so we see here, she brings forth her son, and it says this about him. It says he's going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. When you go back, and you don't have to turn there, I'll read it to you, to the Old Testament. One of the first messianic psalm, or the psalm about the Messiah, is Psalm 2. And Psalm 2 begins with the question, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth, they set themselves, and the rulers to take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed one. But now you go down, and it says in verse 6, yet I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I've declared the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. This day I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the heathen for your inheritance, and the uttermost part of the earth for your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron. You will dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So this description of this child ruling the nations with a rod of iron is used in Psalm 2, describing Jesus Christ. If you remember back in Revelation 2, when we were talking about the 7 churches, the one church, Thyatira, one of its things of the rewards of the overcomers or descriptions, it says they'll rule and reign, they'll rule with a rod and iron. And I believe that's talking about how the believers in Christ, we will rule and reign with him on this earth for 1,000 years. Here's an interesting verse to look up on your own later. Matthew 19:28. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 28, Peter's asking Jesus, hey, we followed you, Lord, and we've forsaken everything we have. What are we going to get out of it? And Jesus said, in the regeneration, talking about his kingdom, he said, you 12 are going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So you see this idea of believers ruling and reigning with Christ. The Jewish apostles reigning over Israel, and maybe we're given different, but we rule and reign with Christ. He rules the nations, it says, with a rod of iron. Christ is going to reign. The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Christ, and he will, what? Reign. And so he's going to reign. And so we see this, and then you see the ascension of Christ. But then it says this. It says, the dragon came after the woman. In verse 6, it says she fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared for her that they would feed her 3.5 years. Well, Jesus in Matthew 24, in one of his prophecies of the end time and the tribulation, had this to say. I didn't put Matthew 24 up there? Wow, okay. I'll turn to Matthew 24 and read it to you. I highlighted it, which means I put it on the screen. So if I didn't, okay, listen to this verse, Matthew 24, and beginning in verse number 15. Jesus said, "When you therefore will see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoever reads, let him understand." We're talking about the end time. We're talking about the Antichrist. Oh, you want to keep going? Keep going. Oh, you don't have to keep going. I'll just read. Oh, then let them, there's going to be a lot of them, so let me just read them, because you're probably not going to be able to keep up with me that way. So he said, when you see the abomination of desolation, when you, basically I'll paraphrase it, when you see the Antichrist come into the temple, when you see him declare himself God, when you see him demanding to be worshiped, when you see him beheading people who don't take the mark of the beast, when you see this happen, let those that are in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return to take his clothes. Woe to them that are with child in those days, and those that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days would be shortened, there no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Jesus is talking to an audience, a Jewish audience in the Gospels, about future prophecy. When in the middle of the tribulation, the Antichrist would set himself up, and he said, when that happens, flee. Flee Jerusalem. Get out of there quick. And so let's go back to chapter 12. It says, the woman fled. The woman's Israel. The woman flees what? From who? Satan and his work. And we're going to see how that's revealed in the Antichrist. She has a place prepared for her where they'll feed her 3.5 years. Now, where's that place? Well, a lot of Bible teachers and commentators over the years said they believed it was going to be the country of Jordan. And the reason for that, in Daniel chapter 11, when it's talking about the Antichrist coming in and going through Israel and some of the havoc he causes in that area, it says that Ammon, Edom, and Moab will escape it. Well, those three ancient lands are found in modern-day Jordan. And it just so happens that modern-day Jordan, when Bill Clinton was president, signed a peace treaty with Israel. And that gave them water rights to the Sea of Galilee. And they have been a great partner in the Middle East with Israel. And so it's always been thought that maybe they'll flee right there. Why? Because it's the wilderness. It's right next to them. That area is going to be preserved. I wouldn't be dogmatic on that because, and it's interesting here, it says, pray that your flight be not in the winter. Back then, what did that mean? It meant your trip, and now I can see it's your flight, right? You don't want a cancellation, You don't want look what happened to our flights in the winter here around Christmas, man. We couldn't go to my niece's wedding. Southwest really dropped the ball there. God says, don't count on Southwest to get you out of there when the Antichrist comes. I don't know if that's what he's saying, but you can let your mind go with this stuff, right? And you can contemplate it. Things that were symbols to them could be actual to us. But whatever it is, this woman is going to be nurtured. And then look what happens in verse 7. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought. Well, that's the fourth personage here. It is Michael. Michael is called in the Bible the archangel. By the way, did you know in the Bible the only angels that have wings are seraphim and cherubim? Did you know regular angels in the Bible do not have wings? That's a medieval kind of artist rendering of angels. So angels, I don't see in the Bible where angels have wings. There's this one creature with wings flying around. I think it's over in Zephaniah or Zechariah, but it's actually a demon with wings, so I don't think we want to go there. But you don't see rank and file angels with wings. As a matter of fact, every time an angel shows up in the Bible, they just look like a man and oftentimes are mistaken for a man. And talks about in heaven they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but they're as the angels in heaven. So I don't know if all angels take on a male form, because the feminine form of angelic beings, that's really a medieval Renaissance understanding. We've seen so many pictures of things, sometimes our mind just automatically reads it into the Bible. The Bible doesn't depict it that way. It's interesting. So anyway, there was war in heaven. Now, when Satan took the third of heaven with him, remember that was past tense, right? That was referring back to the fall of Satan, Lucifer. Now, we're back in the present. So this is a war that takes place in heaven around this 3.5 year point, right? It's this 3.5 years that keeps coming up. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon fought and his angels, and they did not prevail. Neither was there found any more place in heaven. Now, this confuses me, because he's cast out of heaven with a third of the angels, but then he has this war later where they're in heaven again. Now, I don't know why God let him back having access. I think the difference is heaven was his permanent home then. Now he's the God of this world. After the fall of Satan, it does describe sometimes him being in heaven talking to God. Job chapter 1, Satan is there talking to God. And it also takes place in Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 1, and Satan is standing before God. So when Satan got cast out of heaven, his exalted place above the throne of God that's described in Ezekiel chapter 28, he was cast. But you know what? It's like he still had access. Maybe he had access going through that water. Remember there's water up there? How many of y'all remember I talked about water up there? Well, maybe he goes up and down through the water. Because you know in the Old Testament, and I'm going to throw some stuff out at you now. In Job chapter 41, it's a whole chapter about a creature called Leviathan that's described like a dragon who breathes fire out of his mouth. And so it talks about, and then over in the Psalms, it talks about how God breaks the heads of Leviathan in the water, in the sea, plural. And then over in Isaiah, by the way, that was Psalm 74:13, so you can read it for yourself. So Job 41, Psalm 74:13, and Isaiah 27:1 calls Leviathan the piercing serpent that God judges. So I don't know, but there's this dragon-like creature going up and down in water over in the Old Testament called Leviathan that God has a bone to pick with him. So you take it as far as you want, okay? Maybe it's just symbolic of the dragon, Satan, you know, in a human form. Not human form, in an earthly figure. I don't know. But the point is this. Satan somehow, even after his fall, still had access to God. I'm sure it was controlled by God, limited by God, but there was still some access going on. And so I think we tend to think of Satan today as living in hell with a pitchfork, you know, and people go down there and, you know, he's poking them with his fork. He's the God of this world. He's the prince of the power of, by the way, the air. And so anyway, so there's war in heaven. Verse 9, and the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, who deceived the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now has come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. They're getting happy in heaven. The end's coming. Why? The accuser of our brothers is cast down. He accused them before our God day and night. But they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, you that dwell in them. But here's the flip side. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. And when the dragon saw that he was cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. Next week, we'll see a lot of verses in Daniel where God prophesied how they would be persecuted in the last day, the Jews, in the end times by the Antichrist. And the woman were given 2 wings from a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness. I remember when I was a Christian back in the 80s, someone said, that's the United States Air Force there, carrying Israel and delivering her to safety. And I didn't believe it then, and I still don't. But anyway, that is imagery that God uses about Israel being delivered. When she was delivered out of Egypt, it talks about her being borne off on eagle's wings. So there is some figurative speech of that in the Old Testament. And she was brought to her place where she's nourished. Here it is. A time and times and a half a time. 3.5. There you go. There it is all over again. And so she is nourished there. And it says in verse 13, and when the dragon saw that he was cast, he persecuted the woman. The woman brought forth the child. To the woman were given the wings. She was nourished for 3.5 years from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water like a flood after the woman, that might cause her to be carried away of the flood. The earth helped the woman, and the earth opened up her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out. Now, is that a literal flood? I don't know if Satan's got like that much water in his mouth, but the Bible does use the imagery of a flood related to armies. It talks about the enemy coming in like a flood. It talks about the king of the north coming in like a storm into the beautiful land. And so I think it's probably the imagery there of trying to use armies. How does the earth help? I don't know. Maybe there's a great earthquake and it really messes up the battle plan on that day. It's so figurative, I don't know. And it says, I know this, the dragon was wroth with the woman. Satan is not like Israel. And he went to make war with the remnant of her seed, and that would probably be those who did not escape. Those of her seed, he's talking about Jewish people, they keep the commandments. But here's an interesting thing, and they have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So this would be Jews in the tribulation that have come to faith in Christ, maybe through the preaching of the 144,000, right? But they are going to pay the price of following Jesus Christ if you don't take the mark of the beast. And that's what this next chapter, chapter 13, is all about. So chapter 13 is completely about the Antichrist. That's what we're going to really look into next week. Chapter 12, I think, shows us the history of the great cosmic battle between Satan and Israel and what got us to the time of Christ. And the result of that is pertinent to the tribulation period, where we find ourselves in the middle of that time. Amen. Perfect timing. It's 6:30 on the clock over there, which is the right time. So, hey, thank you guys so much. And I'm always fearful that maybe in some ways I'm leaving your head swimming a little bit. That's all right. You just keep listening. You get a little more each time. But there's no replacement for just reading it for yourself and just kind of just praying over it, just asking God to give you little bits here and there. All right? Hey, Lord bless you guys, and I hope you have an awesome rest of the night. And don't you love this?